Hi, and welcome to the Beyond Suffrage exhibit. I'm Sarah Langston, Head of Special Collections at Weber State University.
And I'm Holly Andrew, Curator at the Museums at Union Station.
So Holly, why don't you recap what citizenship means for us?
So citizenship is a relationship between an individual and their state that they belong to. It implies certain freedoms, rights, and responsibilities between that individual and its state.
So during the mid-1800s, were women in Utah considered citizens?
In the mid-1800s, a woman's citizenship was based on their marriage to their husband or their father's status. The same were for women here in Utah.
So would women be allowed to vote in Utah then?
Prior to 1870, women were not allowed to vote.
So what happened in 1870?
In 1870, women in Utah were allowed the right to vote on Valentine's Day for a fact.
On Valentine's Day. So basically, women were allowed to vote here in Utah from 1870 up until 1887. And in 1887, the federal government got involved in the politics of Utah, mostly due to polygamy. There was a huge backlash against polygamy. A lot of people viewed it as wrong, as men taking control over many wives, called the wives slaves in some points. And so the federal government decided, we're not going to admit Utah to a state until they get rid of polygamy. So Senator Edmunds decided to pass the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which made polygamy illegal in the United States, and two, it really focused on disenfranchising women, specifically in Utah. And this was because they felt like women were coming into Utah, marrying Mormon men, and immediately getting the right to vote. And a lot of these women were immigrants, didn't speak the language, didn't know anything about our laws or politics. And so it was basically stacking politics in Utah towards Mormons. And here in Ogden, there was a group of women from the United Methodist Church who were part of the Women's Home Missionary Society. And they got together in the 1879 and had a convention where they talked about polygamy and voting in Utah and decided to form a committee that would go out and investigate this issue. And if they found that they felt like polygamy was influencing politics for the detriment of the state, that they would submit a petition to have polygamy outlawed here. So the women submitted petition to Senator Edmunds asking for the Edmunds-Tucker Act to be passed. When it finally was, they actually sent him what they called an autograph quilt, where these women signed their names to this quilt, thanking him for passing the Edmunds-Tucker Act. And it was really interesting that these were all women from Ogden.
So Sarah, in 1894, what law was passed?
So in 1894, the federal government passed the Enabling Act for Utah. And what this said was that the people would be allowed to vote for the state constitution and state officers.
How'd this relate to somebody in our local community?
So after this law was passed, Sarah Anderson went in 1895 to register to vote in Weber County. She went to register, and the registrar for Weber County said, "You're not allowed to vote because of the Edmunds-Tucker Act." And she said, "But because of the Enabling Act, as I am part of the people of Utah, I should be allowed to vote." So the very next day, she went down and filed a lawsuit against the registrar, demanding that she be allowed to register to vote. So the case went to court, and Judge Smith here in Ogden fined in favor of Sarah Anderson and said, yes, you should be allowed to register to vote. Well, his Salt Lake lawyers did not like that at all. So they immediately appealed the decision, and it went to the Utah Supreme Court. And they said, no, because women aren't considered part of the people in the Enabling Act, she was not allowed to vote.
So this is really important because it is a struggle that we are still trying to define today. When we talk about citizenship under the law, keep in mind that women were not considered full citizens under the law.
Right, so she wasn't part of We the People. So a lot of that changed that very same year in 1895 when Utah started their constitutional convention. So during this time, Utah is fighting to become a state, and suffrage is an important part of that. And a local couple, Emily Tanner Richards and her husband Franklin, emerge on the scene and sort of become the figureheads of the movement. Why don't you talk about them a little bit?
So Emily became the face of Utah suffrage. She worked with Margaret Kane in helping found the Utah Women's Suffrage Association. She was really instrumental in helping form a lot of local chapters, holding rallies, passing out leaflets, giving speeches. She worked alongside her husband Franklin, who was a state legislator at this time, who also fought for women's suffrage at the state level. What's really important is that they fought this during the state constitution convention. So I'd like to read to you a little bit about what Franklin has to say about women's suffrage. So I say that if the price of statehood is the disenfranchisement of one half of the people, if our wives and mothers and daughters are to be accounted either unworthy or incapacitated to exercise the rights and privileges of citizenship, then, however precious the boon may be, it is not worth the price demanded, and I am content to share with them the disabilities of territorial vassalage till the time shall come, as it will come in the providence of God, when all can stand side by side on a broad platform of human equality, of equal rights, and of equal capacity.
So really, they were an important part in getting the Constitution passed, and especially that section that calls for voting rights for men and women, and also gave women the right to run and hold office, which becomes really important during the next election cycle, where we have 3 women, including Sarah Anderson, run for office and elected and being able to serve and represent the community. So in Utah, even though women had the right to vote, they were still heavily active in the suffrage movement. Susan B. Anthony came to Utah quite often, and they used Utah women as a shining example of what can happen when women are given the right to vote. That unlike what B.H. Roberts said during the Constitutional Convention, where the world would fall apart if women were given the right to vote, they said, look, women had the right to vote in Utah for 17 years and nothing happened. You know, laws were still being made, things were still moving forward. Women didn't destroy the entire city or state. So once women got the right to vote, what did they do with it?
So in this case, for Utah, women had the right to vote for 17 plus years. And so basically they allowed their voices to be heard. They, in this state, held office. They were able to make reforms on child care services and other different kinds of things like that.
Yeah, so one great example of that is Dr. Jane Schofield. So Jane was from Weber County. She actually started the first Ogden free kindergarten. And then after a while, she decided, I want to become a doctor. So she went to Denver and got her medical degree. And then she came back to Utah and started a practice in Salt Lake. And at the hospital, she really instituted training for nurses. She wanted them to come into the position well-trained and knowing what they were doing. She also ran for the state legislature and was elected in 1912. And she was heavily involved in bills that dealt with medicine and healthcare, and women and children especially. And so I think Jane is a great example of these local women who used their voice to go forth and impact the community.
Basically, these women were able to use their voice to strengthen, shape, and form their communities. So it's important to understand that the 19th Amendment is not a triumphant culmination, but a milestone in our fight for equal rights. It gave women the opportunity and the voice to vote, but it also
opened a lot of different spheres for them to move forward and impact the community.
We invite you to honor and draw inspiration from the women in this exhibit and many more by going to beyondsuffrage.org.